Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-8444-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. My name is Adrian Goldberg. Thousands of Newcastle United supporters are still celebrating their Carabao Cup final against Liverpool, their first domestic trophy in 70 years. It's also what human rights campaigners are calling a victory for sportswashing. In the aftermath of the Geordie's 2-1 success, dancing around the Wembley pitch, holding the cup aloft, was their chairman, Yasser Al-Rumayyan, the face of the club's owners, the Saudi Public Investment Fund, or the PIF. Now, we don't want to rain on the parade of Tyneside's long-suffering soccer supporters, but the PIF is chaired by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, Saudi's de facto ruler, and a man suspected by the CIA, no less, of commissioning the murder or capture of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was brutally killed inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018. I spoke to Khashoggi's widow, Hanan El-Athar, last October. She was keen to stress that although Jamal was living in exile, he saw himself as a Saudi patriot, not as a dissident.
Jamal Khashoggi was not a dissident, was not opponent. He said it himself in an interview. You can retrieve it from YouTube. Jamal Khashoggi considered himself a well-educated advisor to his country, and he believed he have a responsibility to try to amend things before it's getting worse. In sense, he believed he have to share internally within the kingdom itself. It have to be more democratic, more tolerance for different opinion, and more listening for opinion for a people who's experter in a different field like politics, like constitution, like looking for freedom, democratic, regardless it's a republic or reality. He does not focus at all who's in the top. He focus of the act of the top, regardless, and he made it very clear. He obeys the swear for the throne of Saudi Kingdom. He obeys for the promise to support Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman about fighting corruption and getting justice for everything. But Jamal Khashoggi was not happy about there is not enough transparent and not enough listening to a different opinion within the kingdom itself. Jamal Khashoggi, again, he's not a dissident.
Now, I should say that MBS has insisted he didn't know in advance about Jamal's killing and has since described it, and I quote, as a mistake. But what about Saudi Arabia's more general denial of free speech, its repression of women, its mistreatment of migrant workers? How far should this colour our perception of Newcastle United's long-awaited moment of triumph? Well, I'm joined by Peter Sagar from NUFC against Sportwashing. He also writes for Northeast Bylines, and by John Hurd, the founder of Newcastle United FC, Fans Against Sportswashing. Peter, welcome. What's the mood like in Newcastle? I imagine there's jubilation. I know how football mad Tyneside is.
There is, certainly has been a long time since there was a domestic trophy, far too long, really. And the fact that it's actually now happened and it's a worthwhile trophy being won has led to jubilation. But I think there's also a sense of unease as well. I think there are those who are completely in denial and just think it's all great and the Saudis are great and everything else. But I think there's quite a lot of supporters as well who, while are very pleased that Newcastle United have finally won a major worthwhile trophy, are also a little bit uneasy about it. I saw a comment on the BBC website from a fan who said that he would be celebrating the triumph, but it's a bittersweet triumph because he's only too well aware of who's bought the triumph, really, and who's paid for it, and the circumstances in which that has happened. So there is celebration. I'm sitting not far away from the Angel of the North, and by Monday that had a huge Newcastle strip on it, a celebration. But there's also definitely a sense of unease as well.
My sense, Peter, and you may correct me, is that that sense of unease is pretty much a minority feeling, though, in that Newcastle United supporters broadly have welcomed the investment from Saudi Arabia. There are long-standing supporters like yourself who speak out in opposition to it, but Newcastle United is the archetypal sleeping giants of football, and many people feel that this is, at long last, Newcastle United getting its due dose of investment.
Well, needed some investment. The Ashley years were grim. There's no question of that. And he was just, messing about and taking the fans for granted and taking the mickey, really. And certainly there are a lot of fans who just are very pleased and very happy that they're getting the investment from anywhere, really. But it's a funny thing, if you actually say to fans, I'm not so happy because of this, and you just quote a few things, not a single fan I've met has argued back. Every single supporter has gone, oh, well, yeah, and then they move on the conversation. And in fact, a lot of people now know not to mention Newcastle United with me. And that suggests to me that there is unease. And that suggests to me that deep down people don't necessarily think it's right. But I think they were just so desperate. I think the club was chosen specifically because of its lack of success and lack of funding in the past. And I think it was chosen very carefully to find a club where there would be as little dissent as possible because the fans were basically so desperate and they had such an appalling owner in Mike Ashley. But I do think that it is interesting that fans are not willing to really engage at all. I have not really met a fan who said, oh, no, it's okay, it's great. It might be my social circle's different, to be fair. But as soon as I start mentioning the human rights issues, people clam up and they move the conversation on. And that tells you something, I think.
John Hurd, you are the founder of Newcastle United Fans Against Sportswashing. And as a result of Newcastle's victory in the Carabao Cup final, we've revisited the story here now, a story we've covered a couple of times or more here on the Byline podcast and in Byline Time. So perhaps there is a sense in which this could rebound a little bit on the Saudi Public Investment Fund, in that it does allow people like you a platform to shine a light on Saudi Arabia's many human rights abuses.
Yes, that's true. And our campaign's existed for 3 years. It's had its ups and downs and its ebbs and flows. But, along with people like Peter, Amnesty, Newcastle and trade unionists as well, we've managed to keep the issue in the public arena. One of the things we've noticed recently is that the issue hasn't gone away. We've been contacted by trade unionists at the university who've raised points which we were aware of, but they're actually very concerned about, because after the visit of Keir Starmer, where he incidentally stupidly invited MBS to a football match, hopefully not come to Newcastle, he'll go to Arsenal. Where he did that, the Newcastle mayor was there. And basically they said, we're going to invite Saudi companies or Saudi entities to invest in the university and to work with scientists and basically exercising greenwashing. We've been contacted by trade unions there who are unhappy. One of them was quoted in the Chronicle yesterday saying, we're not comfortable with this, being used by the Saudi state. Also, trade unionists at the university have said, why should we be working with the Saudis? And we've got a policy of pro-LGBTQI plus rights, and they persecute gay people. So it hasn't gone away. Peter can expand on this himself, but he said something quite profound, I thought, yesterday. He said the totalitarian policies, the anti-human rights stance of the Saudis, jailing of young people, putting minors on death row, that hasn't changed. That hasn't gone away. It's still there. And I share Peter's view about this. Since the final, we've had people contacting us, actually people who were at the final, who said finally they're going to write articles for our website, for our publications, because it was just too much to see Yasser Al-Rumayyan hogging the cup, running around the Wembley turf. For them, obviously, they've paid for it and they're going to milk it as much as they can. We know that the Saudi ambassador was there as well, Rumayyan. So, yeah, it hasn't gone away. And I think we are a small campaign, but I think we've made some big steps forward. You know that we managed to get, after 3 years of lobbying, a Saudi human rights delegation, which included 2 sisters of women who've been jailed and tortured and abused in prison. Now, I just want to highlight this because it sort of reveals what's happening in the Northeast. It's not just about the football fans. That's the thing. What happened there was this delegation, which had Lina Al-Athul and also the sister of Manahal Al-Tabi, whose sister has disappeared in prison. They don't know where she is. They asked directly the council leader, Karen Kilgore, they asked her, will you have a photo taken with us outside the Civic Centre with our banner and show some basic solidarity? And she was advised not to do that. The council leader refused. Now, imagine a Labour council which has official policies against modern-day slavery, which you mentioned, and also a pro-human rights, refusing having a photo taken. And it's like Lena said when she first came to Newcastle, how much does it cost to buy your silence? And then the next week, Karen Kilgore, the council leader, is outside in the same spot in the Civic Centre, draped in a Newcastle flag, giving the freedom of the city to Eddie Howe. But what about freedom for Manahal Al-Tabi? The human rights delegation gave 8 demands, suggestions to the council, and I'm not going to list them all, but one of them was adopting a prisoner of conscience like Manahal, but also whenever the Saudi state is clearly taking advantage of their ownership for sports washing purposes to promote the state, that the council would put up a placard or a photograph of a Saudi prisoner of conscience like Manahal.
And for people who've listened to this podcast before, they'll know the story of Lina Al-Hathlul's sister, Lou Jane. Lou Jane was one of the activists who campaigned for women to be allowed to drive, and women have been since allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. But those who campaigned for the right of women to drive, like Lou Jane, were imprisoned, tortured, and accused of collaborating with enemy states for raising their campaign through the UK, through the European Union, and so on. For people who don't know about Manahal's story, just briefly take us through that, John.
Manahal is one of 3 sisters. She was a fitness trainer, and she did quite a modest campaign. She had photographs on Instagram of her working under the hashtag no to male guardianship. That was it. Quite a simple campaign, but she's committed to that. And I've seen a video, a lot like the clip played at the beginning. She said, I'm only following the public statements of MBS, which said that he wants to reform. So I'm doing it. And she was arrested for that, disappeared, as the family said. One of her sisters has escaped and she's in Edinburgh. And she came to Newcastle. And one of the things that happens is that basically the families of these prisoners are held hostage. So they're not allowed to say anything. So that's why the sister is in Edinburgh, so she can talk about it, and she's campaigning on the issue. And it's a terrible thing, but what's happened, she's been sentenced to 11 years under terrorism laws for a hashtag no to male guardianship. And she had her leg broken. She was abused. She was stabbed in the face with a pen. And the worst thing is that up until today, they don't know really where she is. I think they've got a vague idea of the prison, but not in contact. So it's a very terrible situation. But, Manahal is just one of many. This is the thing. We highlight some of the famous cases, but there are countless numbers of people in prison.
And it's worth pointing out, as a matter of fact, that the Public Investment Fund is not supposed to have day-to-day control of Newcastle United. That was part of the deal that was brokered between the Premier League and Newcastle United, and there was involvement at some level by the UK government. Clearly, MBS was very unhappy that the initial takeover of Newcastle United had been blocked by the Premier League. He wasn't forced to go through their owners and directors test, which measures whether you are, they don't use this phrase now, but whether you are fit and proper, because it was then agreed that the Public Investment Fund wouldn't, in fact, have any day-to-day control of Newcastle. But he is the chairman, the Public Investment Fund is the owner, and the Public Investment Fund is ultimately there for the benefit of Saudi Arabia, a country run by MBS. So all sorts of contortions going on there. Go on, John.
Can we just clarify that? Because I think it's actually the case that the PIF owns more than 80% of the shares now because they bought out Amanda Staveley. But the PIF as an entity, they control the majority of the shares. The argument was whether the Saudi state controls the PIF. And that's an interesting thing because right at the beginning, that was the main argument of politicians in the Northeast, the council, and also a lot of fans are saying the state is separate to the PIF. Now, it's noticeable. Nobody even bothers to say that now. Everyone just accepts that the Saudi state controls Newcastle.
People can try and say, oh, look, it's just a Saudi PIF. It's not the state. They can say that all they want. But last November, Human Rights Watch brought out a 90-page report, or more than 90 pages, showing clearly the links between not the Saudi state, but the Saudi Public Investment Fund, the people who are the majority owners of Newcastle United, and grievous, appalling human rights abuses. So it's all been documented by Human Rights Watch in their report last November that the Saudi PIF, the majority owners of Newcastle United, are directly involved in terrible human rights abuses. It's all there.
There's also another dimension to this, Peter, which people outside the Northeast perhaps might not appreciate, which is the impact of austerity on the city of Newcastle, on the local authority in Newcastle. Since austerity, £369 million has been removed from the council's budget. And like many areas outside of London and the southeast, the region around Newcastle has multiple deprivation. So the carrot here is not just investment in Newcastle United, but investment across the whole of the northeast from Saudi Arabia. That was part of the political dimension to this as well. The Conservative mission to level up parts of the Midlands and the North that had been left behind. That's woven into this story of the Newcastle United takeover.
It is, but firstly, where's all the investment been? Where is it? Secondly, if there is investment, serious investment in the region, who will benefit from it? Will it be ordinary Geordies, ordinary people in Newcastle who benefit from it? Or will it actually be the Saudis? It's very telling, I think, if you go to Manchester, where the United Arab Emirates have been, of course, owning Manchester City for over 10 years now, and they've invested in Manchester, and you can see it from miles away because it's large, multi-storey, luxury flats. You come out of Victoria Station in Manchester, and within about 30 seconds, you come across the first homeless person. The Northeast has been treated appallingly for many decades now, but especially since 2010. And austerity is a serious matter. And it's also a serious matter that it doesn't seem to be improving under this government either, of course. But I wouldn't necessarily expect investment from Saudi Arabia to solve the problems that have been caused by austerity. Because Saudi Arabia or any other country like that are only going to invest in the Northeast because they want a return. They want a profit from it. And they're going to invest for their benefit, not out the kindness of their heart or for the benefit of the people of the region. And one of the investments that has happened since Northeast Combined Authority Mayor Kim McGuinness went with Keir Starmer to Saudi Arabia last December is that there is going to be a link up about creating hydrogen. And this is supposed to be clean, green energy. Yet I have not been able to find out exactly what kind of hydrogen it is. And there are different types of hydrogen. And there is green hydrogen, which is made from green sources. So that's great. But there's also blue hydrogen, which is made from natural gas. And that's obviously keeping business as usual going and keeping fossil fuels being used. And it just so happens that Saudi Arabia has the 5th largest natural gas reserves in the world. So I wonder really if all this investment in clean energy in the region is really just about helping Saudi Arabia keep business as usual, and it's not really quite as green as it might be seen to be. And it might not be quite as beneficial for the people in the region or elsewhere as they might seem to be.
Not long after the Newcastle United takeover, an investment of £1 billion was announced in petrochemicals by a Saudi company called SABIC in Teesside, not in Tyneside, but not too far from Newcastle, in closer to Middlesbrough. And I think that was unofficially seen as part of the dividend for allowing Saudi Arabia to become involved at Newcastle United.
Yes. And the government is also trumpeting the idea of doing carbon capture on Teesside, which actually is not really going to help the climate crisis at all, because you're still allowing carbon to be used and it will be transported. And I think there's an awful lot of smoke and mirrors going on in terms of investment from Saudi Arabia in the northeast, full stop.
Also, I think that the Saudi state as well, they haven't got infinite resources. Look at the problems that they're having in the NEOM project, which was supposed to be hundreds of kilometers long. It's getting shorter and shorter every day. Western companies that were investing in it, thinking they were going to get a lot of money, are having to pull out. It's been really reduced. They're going to have to pay for the World Cup unless we can stop it in 2034. So this idea that there's like pots of money going to be invested, it's 3 years got down the line and there's nothing concrete. Amnesty Newcastle have a subcommittee and they've published reports on this, and they say it's very little investment. And I think it's actually a little bit pathetic as well that Labour councils, instead of like getting organised and campaigning and trying to get funds from the government, doing it themselves, they're going cap in hand to a dictatorial, totalitarian regime. Is that the kind of money, is that the kind of investment that they want? It's on the table at the moment about Newcastle International Airport that 49% of the shares are being discussed in secret in council committees that they're going to sell it to Saudi Arabia. That's a situation where it's not just Newcastle City Council, it also includes Sunderland, Durham, other councils which own the airport being bounced into relationship with the Saudi state. You know, there needs to be more transparency about this.
NEOM, for people who don't know, I'm sure most of our listeners will, is a city of the future being built by Saudi Arabia, but which ITV, amongst others, have identified serious abuses to migrant workers in the construction of NEOM. John, I just want to talk specifically about Newcastle United again for a moment, because Saudi Arabia has something called Vision 2030, and that's a much more encompassing vision than simply football in your city. It's about liberalizing the society of Saudi Arabia. It also involves developing tourism. It involves other sports such as golf, for example, in which Saudi Arabia has taken an active interest. It involves their hosting of the World Cup in 2034, which was nodded through without a vote by FIFA. And I noticed recently that almost in an echo of Vision 2030, Newcastle United were talking about Project 2030. Their second and third kits have started to bear an uncanny resemblance at times to Saudi Arabia's national green colour. So this intertwining of Saudi Arabia with Newcastle United, it's there for all to see.
That's true. We're privileged to work with Saudi Arabian human rights advocates. And when we talk to them about that, about these visions, they would say it's better to call it Oppression 2030, because there's nothing in this project which talks about democratization, which talks about human rights, rights for workers, building the stadiums if it comes off the 2034 Cup. And I think this is not going to go away. The more Newcastle becomes intertwined, the worse the reputation. I was just reflecting about on Sunday, if we'd won a cup when Bobby Robson or Kevin Keegan were managers, imagine the neutrals, inverted commas, imagine the response there would have been. We didn't get it this time, and Newcastle fans are feeling it as well. You can tell. They're saying, why are you picking on us? I even heard some fans having a go at football journalists who dared to mention that they were owned by the Saudi state. I'm afraid Newcastle fans are going to have to get used to it. Journalists have to do their job. As a campaign, we have to do our job as well to keep reminding. So at the moment, we're just thinking about what's going to happen, in the future. I think that these questions are not going to go away, and we can keep going. I think there's a lot of traction for the campaign.
Peter, we're at a political point in our country now where we have a government which is committed to growth, where there appears to be very little growth in the economy happening organically. And they will look, just as the Conservative government before them looked, to countries like Saudi Arabia for significant investment. And it's going to be very difficult, isn't it, to say to this government, Saudi Arabia should not be involved in our economy, that it should not be involved in one of our leading football clubs. I've also spoken to Newcastle United fans who say, how many people will complain about Saudi Arabia when they fill up at the petrol pump? How many will complain when Saudi Arabia has, through the Public Investment Fund, fingers in so many pies in our entertainment world? This isn't going to go away, is it?
It's not, but this whole issue of growth and this agenda that Starmer and the Labour government, and I think particularly Rachel Reeves and those behind her, that they have, is a very interesting agenda. Because, at the end of the day, it's growth for whom? Who's actually benefiting from this growth if it happens at all anyway? There was quite an infamous or famous event when Ahmed Menem from a pro-EU group came to Newcastle during the Brexit referendum. He was talking, I think, about how the GDP would fall for Britain if we left the EU. And of course, that's happened. He was quite right. But there was a woman in Newcastle back in 2016 shouted out, "It's your bloody GDP, not ours." And now I've voted to remain, and I simply should have done. But that was a very, very important point, wasn't it? What's the point of growth anyway if it's only benefiting a small percentage of the population, a small part of the country for that matter? Because you've still got the Treasury Green Book there, which means that most of the investment in this country is still going to be located, unless it's drastically changed, in London and the South East, because the rules of a Treasury yard has to go where you can get the quickest, best return. So it's not going to go to Newcastle or Liverpool or Manchester or any place, or let alone the smaller towns outside them. So yes, we do need economic growth, but we need growth that is sustainable. We need growth that is benefiting ordinary working people and, may I say, disabled people and others who can't work, because I think that makes mentioning this week as well. I think you have to see who that growth is benefiting and where it's really benefiting and who's gaining from it really.
Peter, thank you for your time. Peter Sagar from Newcastle United Fans Against Sportswashing. Thanks also to John Hurd, the founder of Newcastle United Fans Against Sportswashing. Really interesting debate. I'm sure you'll agree. If you've enjoyed it and you want to support our work, then please take out a subscription to the Byline Times. It's our brilliant monthly news periodical, which contains the best of our online articles with content that you can't read anywhere else. Head over to bylinetimes.com to find out how you can subscribe. This episode of the Byline podcast has been produced in Birmingham by me and by Harvey White. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Byline.